The unlikely encounter. Ethan stood at the entrance of the diplomatic hall, nervously adjusting his tie for the third time. The room was prepared with Earth's finest dishes, plates of steaming pasta, roasted vegetables, delicate pastries, and exotic fruits. Everything gleamed under the soft golden lights, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Tonight, he was hosting Seraphina, the alien princess from Andromeda. Her visit to Earth was part of a fragile peace agreement between her people and humanity. This was Ethan's chance to impress her, to show the best Earth had to offer. But deep down, he doubted whether a table full of food could really make any difference. Rumors about Seraphina filled the air before her arrival. She was described as cold, distant, and nearly impossible to please. Some said her eyes could pierce through a person's soul, reading thoughts like pages of an open book. Others claimed she rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were as sharp as knives. Ethan had laughed at the rumors at first, but now, standing in front of the shimmering dining hall, he wasn't so sure. The doors finally slid open with a soft hum. Two tall, silver-armored guards entered first, scanning the room with glowing blue eyes. Behind them, Seraphina appeared, her presence calm but commanding. Her long, pale hair flowed like silk, and her silver robes shimmered faintly, almost as if woven from starlight itself. Ethan stepped forward, offering his hand in greeting. "Welcome, Princess Seraphina. I'm Ethan, Earth's diplomatic envoy. It's an honor to have you here." Seraphina's eyes, violet and unblinking, met his gaze. For a moment, she said nothing, simply observing him. Then, with a slight nod, she placed her delicate hand in his. Her skin felt cool, almost like marble, yet there was something gentle about her touch. "I appreciate the welcome," she replied in a voice as soft as falling snow. Ethan guided her to the table, pulling out a chair. "I've prepared a selection of Earth's best dishes. Our cultures may be different, but I believe food can connect us in ways words cannot." Seraphina lowered herself into the chair gracefully, her eyes scanning the table without emotion. Ethan watched carefully as the first plate of roasted vegetables was placed in front of her. She lifted a fork, took a single bite, and set it down. "Is it to your liking?" Ethan asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of his voice. "It is fine," Seraphina said, though her tone betrayed no excitement or pleasure. Ethan's heart sank a little. He had expected something more, some sign of interest, even mild curiosity. But Seraphina seemed indifferent, as if the food barely mattered. Course after course was served, and with each bite, her expression remained unreadable. Ethan tried to make small talk, sharing light stories about Earth's culture, holidays, and traditions. But Seraphina responded with only brief, polite nods. As the dessert arrived, an intricately crafted chocolate sculpture, Ethan leaned forward, searching for a way to spark her interest. "This dessert," he explained, "represents unity. It's made from ingredients sourced from every continent on Earth. Each piece carries the flavor of a different land." Seraphina examined the dessert but did not take a bite. Instead, she spoke quietly. "Your people value food greatly." Ethan smiled, hoping he'd found common ground. "Yes, food brings us together. It's how we celebrate, mourn, and connect. Sharing a meal is like sharing a piece of our lives." Seraphina's violet eyes lingered on the dessert, but there was a flicker of something else, something distant. "For my people," she said slowly, "food is fuel. We do not attach emotion to it as you do." Ethan paused, realizing his mistake. He had been trying to reach her through something that meant little to her kind. It was like offering a gift to someone who had no need for it. "I see," Ethan replied, carefully choosing his next words. "Then what is it that your people value most?" Seraphina glanced toward the window, where Earth's sprawling cities glowed softly beneath the night sky. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze distant and thoughtful. "Connection," she finally answered, her voice barely above a whisper, "but not through gestures or material things. We seek understanding, a bond that cannot be bought or forced? Ethan's brow furrowed as he tried to understand the weight behind her words. Understanding. He had been so focused on impressing her with Earth's finest luxuries that he overlooked something deeper. As the evening continued, the unease in the room lingered. Ethan realized that impressing Serafina wasn't about the food or extravagant displays. She craved something far more difficult to offer: genuine emotional connection. But how could he provide that? And more importantly, could he bridge the gap between two worlds that seemed so vastly different? As Serafina rose from the table to leave, Ethan knew one thing for certain: this encounter was only the beginning. The cultural misunderstanding. Ethan couldn't stop replaying the evening in his head. The polished silverware, the gleaming dishes, the careful arrangement of every meal. It had all seemed perfect. But to Serafina, it was nothing more than sustenance. Sitting alone in his office the next morning, Ethan stared at the faint outline of the alien princess's seat, as if hoping it held some answer. His reflection stared back at him from the glass window, the city skyline stretching beyond in soft hues of early dawn. He sighed and leaned back. Food is just fuel to them, he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. How do you connect with someone who doesn't care about the things we value most? A quiet knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Mira, his assistant, carrying a datapad under her arm. Her short, neat hair framed a face full of curiosity. Still thinking about last night? She asked, raising an eyebrow as she stepped inside. Ethan nodded. I thought food would be the way in. It always works with visiting diplomats, but Serafina barely reacted to any of it. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. Mira set the datapad down and crossed her arms. I've been reading up on Andromedan culture. It's not just food that's different. Their whole society isn't driven by pleasure the way ours is. Ethan looked up. What do you mean? Mira pulled up a holographic display from the pad, projecting an image of Andromeda's sprawling cities, vast structures with smooth curves and glowing spires. Yet, despite their beauty, something about them felt distant, almost lifeless. There were no vibrant markets, no street performers, no signs of leisure. They're highly advanced, Mira continued, scrolling through the data. But they don't indulge in luxury or entertainment the way we do. Everything they create is built with purpose. Art, music, even technology. It all serves a specific role in their society. Ethan furrowed his brow. So, there's no room for personal joy. Mira hesitated. Not exactly. It's more that their joy comes from deeper, more spiritual experiences. They value connection and shared understanding. But it's not something they express outwardly. It's more internal. Ethan exhaled, tapping his fingers against the desk. That explains a lot. I was trying to dazzle her with things that mean nothing in her world. Mira gave him a half smile. To be fair, it's not like you could have known. This isn't exactly in the diplomatic handbook. Ethan leaned forward, resting his chin on his clasped hands. If material things don't impress her, then what does? Mira's expression softened. I don't think she wants to be impressed. I think she wants to feel understood. The word struck a chord. Ethan recalled the brief flicker of emotion in Serafina's eyes when she spoke about connection. There had been a weight behind her words, something she wasn't saying directly. He stood up abruptly. I need to try something else, something more personal. Mira smirked. Good luck. You're going to need it. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself standing outside the embassy's garden, watching as Serafina strolled among the flowers. The alien princess moved with the same ethereal grace she had the night before, but now, without the formal constraints of the dinner, she seemed more relaxed. Ethan approached slowly, careful not to disturb the peaceful air. Princess Serafina, he greeted. She turned, her violet eyes catching the sunlight in an almost shimmering way. Ethan, she replied with a nod. I hope the accommodations have been comfortable, he said, falling in step beside her. They have, Serafina replied. Her gaze drifted over the blossoms, though she made no move to touch them. Your world is vibrant in ways mine is not. Ethan noticed the distant tone in her voice. You don't have gardens like this in Andromeda. Seraphina's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. We have gardens, but they are designed for function, medicine, food growth. Rarely are they cultivated for beauty alone. Ethan let the silence linger for a moment. Then he took a small chance. You know, I've always believed beauty doesn't need a purpose. Sometimes it just exists to remind us of what's important. Seraphina glanced at him, her expression unreadable, but something in her eyes softened. Is that how your people see things? She asked. Some of us, Ethan replied honestly. But I think it's not so different from what you said. We all search for connection in our own way. Some of us find it through things like food or art. Others, he paused, looking at her, find it through understanding. Seraphina's gaze lingered on him for longer this time, as if weighing his words carefully. I have met many humans, she said quietly, but few have tried to understand me as you have. Ethan smiled. Maybe that's because they were too busy trying to impress you. For the first time, Seraphina laughed softly. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was genuine. A small crack in the cold facade she wore so often. In that moment, Ethan realized something. This wasn't about diplomacy, treaties, or fragile peace agreements. It was about something simpler, yet far more powerful. Understanding. And perhaps that was the first step in forging something truly lasting between their worlds. A deeper connection. The sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the embassy gardens. Ethan stood near a stone bench, watching as Seraphina quietly observed the setting sun. Her expression was calm, but there was something distant in her eyes, like she was here, yet not fully present. Ethan wasn't sure how long they had been standing there in silence, but he didn't mind. He had learned over the past few days that Seraphina rarely filled space with unnecessary words. Where humans might feel awkward and try to force conversation, she seemed content in the quiet. Still, Ethan felt the weight of their differences. Every attempt to engage her with Earth's customs, food, art, music, had led to polite but lukewarm responses. It wasn't that Seraphina was unkind, but her reactions were distant, like she was reaching for something she couldn't quite grasp. He knew now that understanding her wasn't going to be as simple as finding the right dish or presenting her with Earth's greatest achievements. She was looking for something else. Ethan, Seraphina's voice broke the stillness, soft but clear. She hadn't turned to look at him. Instead, her gaze remained locked on the horizon. Yes, princess, he responded, stepping closer. Tell me, she began, why does your kind hold on to stories from the past? I see your people celebrate old traditions, retell myths, and share memories. What purpose does it serve? Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He wasn't sure how to explain something so ingrained in human nature. I think it reminds us of who we are, he replied thoughtfully. Stories help us remember the struggles we've faced, the lessons we've learned. They keep us connected to the people who came before us. Seraphina finally turned to face him, her violet eyes shimmering under the fading light. And do these stories bring you comfort? He nodded. Sometimes, yes. They remind us that even in the hardest times, we're not alone. Someone else has faced similar challenges, and their experiences can guide us. For a moment, Seraphina said nothing, but Ethan noticed the faintest shift in her expression, a flicker of emotion she quickly tried to mask. Where I come from, she said after a pause. Stories are not shared so openly. Strength is valued above all else. Emotions are seen as distractions. Ethan furrowed his brow. That sounds lonely. It is. Her response was so quiet that Ethan almost missed it. Seraphina began to walk along the garden path, and Ethan followed beside her. The soft hum of insects filled the air, and lanterns began to flicker to life along the stone walkway. I think your people are wrong about emotions, Ethan said, glancing at her. They're not a distraction. They're what make us who we are. Without them, everything feels empty. Serafina's steps slowed, and she glanced at him curiously. You speak as though you've experienced this emptiness. Ethan let out a soft chuckle, though there wasn't much humor in it. I have. A few years ago, I lost someone close to me. For a while, I tried to shut everything out, told myself feeling nothing was easier than dealing with the pain. Serafina studied him carefully. And did it help? He shook his head. No, it just made the world colder. I realized that pain isn't something you can escape. The only way forward is to let yourself feel it, even if it hurts. For the first time since her arrival, Ethan saw genuine curiosity in Serafina's eyes, as if his words had struck a chord. I have known loss, she admitted softly, but I was taught to bury it, to move forward without allowing it to linger. Ethan met her gaze. Maybe that's why you feel disconnected here. Earth isn't perfect, but we don't hide from our feelings. We wear them openly, even when they make us vulnerable. Serafina lowered her head slightly, as if processing his words. I wonder, she mused quietly, if your way is better. Ethan smiled gently. I'm not sure if it's better, but it's real. And sometimes, real is all we need. The two continued walking, the silence between them no longer heavy but comforting. There was a subtle shift in the air, something unspoken passing between them. As they neared the garden's exit, Serafina stopped abruptly, her gaze locked on a small group of children playing near the fountain. Their laughter echoed softly, and one of the children held up a small paper lantern, letting it float gently into the sky. Serafina watched them with quiet fascination. They find joy in the simplest things, she observed. Ethan nodded. Children don't overthink. They just experience things as they come. Maybe there's something to learn from that. Serafina remained still, watching the children for a long moment. Then, to Ethan's surprise, she turned to him with a rare, almost shy expression. Would it be strange if I joined them? She asked softly. Ethan smiled warmly. Not at all. I think they'd love it. As Serafina approached the children, Ethan hung back, watching with quiet satisfaction as the once distant alien princess knelt beside the group, her cold exterior softening just a little more. It wasn't diplomacy or grand gestures that had brought them here. It was something far simpler: shared stories, mutual understanding, and the willingness to open up, even if only a little. And as the lanterns floated higher into the night sky, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something far deeper than any treaty. A heartfelt attempt. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the moment Serafina knelt by the children, her usually distant expression softening as they handed her small paper lanterns. It was the first real glimpse of vulnerability he had seen from her. But as the evening passed, and the children eventually left, Serafina's guarded nature slowly returned. By the time she stepped back into the embassy, she once again wore the mask of composure. Ethan sat at his desk later that night, the soft hum of city lights filtering through the large window behind him. He tapped his pen against his notebook absent-mindedly, staring at a blank page. The words he wanted to write about the day's progress refused to come. He leaned back in his chair with a sigh, staring at the ceiling. I'm getting somewhere, but it's not enough, he muttered to himself. Ethan wasn't just trying to form a diplomatic bond. He wanted Serafina to feel something genuine. He had learned enough about her people to understand that they didn't build connections easily. Emotions were carefully buried beneath layers of responsibility and logic. But Serafina wasn't just her title. There was someone underneath it all, and Ethan was determined to reach her. The next morning, Ethan stood outside the embassy's private quarters, holding a small wooden box. His knuckles hovered over the door for a moment before he knocked lightly. A few seconds passed before the door slid open. Serafina stood there, her silver robe cascading softly over her shoulders. Her violet eyes regarded him with calm curiosity. Ethan, she greeted. Is something the matter? Not exactly, Ethan said with a faint smile. I thought I'd stop by and show you something. If you have time. Serafina hesitated for a brief moment, then stepped aside, allowing him in. The room was modest, decorated minimally, just as he expected. There were no personal touches, no decorations. It felt more like a temporary station than a home. Ethan set the box on the table and carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of small, polished stones, each etched with intricate symbols and delicate patterns. "What are these?" Serafina asked, peering at the contents with quiet interest. "They're called story stones," Ethan explained. "It's an old tradition from one of Earth's older cultures. People used to carve stories into stones and pass them down through generations." He picked up one of the stones, running his fingers over the worn edges. Each symbol represents a part of someone's life, something important that they didn't want to forget. By sharing these stones, they'd pass down memories, lessons, and emotions. It kept them connected, even long after they were gone. Serafina reached out, gently tracing the patterns on one of the stones. "Your people place great value on memories," she observed quietly. Ethan nodded. "Memories are part of who we are. We don't just pass down knowledge. We pass down feelings. It's how we stay close to those we've lost." For a long time, Serafina didn't speak. Her fingers lingered over one stone in particular, a smooth, dark one with a spiral carved into the center. After a moment, she finally spoke. "In my world, we are taught to let go of the past. We are told that memories only hold us back from progress." Ethan leaned against the table. "But do you believe that?" Serafina's gaze flickered to his for a brief second before returning to the stone. "I'm not certain anymore." Ethan's voice softened. "I don't think memories hold us back. I think they give us strength. They remind us of what we've overcome, and they help us find hope in the future." Serafina placed the stone back into the box carefully, as though handling something fragile. "Would you like to make one?" Ethan asked, surprising even himself with the suggestion. Her eyes lifted to meet his, searching his expression for meaning. "A story stone." He nodded. "I have carving tools here. If you'd like, you can make one for yourself. Something personal. You don't have to share the meaning if you don't want to." There was a long pause. Ethan half expected her to refuse, to retreat behind her usual composure. But to his surprise, she nodded faintly. "I would like that," she said softly. Ethan retrieved the blank stone from the box and placed it gently in front of her, handing her the small carving tool. Serafina hesitated, the tool resting in her hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, she began to carve. The movements were careful, deliberate. Ethan watched quietly, sensing this was something she rarely allowed herself to do, create something for no other purpose than to hold onto a part of herself. As the minutes passed, the pattern on the stone began to take shape, soft, swirling lines that intertwined gently like the flow of water. Ethan didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. When Serafina finally set the tool down, there was a quiet pride in her eyes, a flicker of something human, something real. She held the stone up to the light, watching the patterns cast faint shadows on the wall. "I think I understand now," she said softly. "It's not the stone that holds meaning. It's the act of making it, the time spent reflecting." Ethan smiled. "Exactly." Serafina placed the stone carefully in her robe pocket, letting her fingers linger on it briefly. "I will keep this with me," she said. "Thank you, Ethan." He dipped his head. "Anytime." As Serafina left the room, Ethan leaned back against the table, watching the door close behind her. He knew that this small moment wouldn't erase all the walls Serafina had built over the years, but it was a start. One stone, one story, one step closer to bridging the distance between their worlds. The unexpected gesture. The next evening, Ethan found himself pacing in the embassy's main hall, glancing at the clock more often than he cared to admit. His fingers tapped lightly against the edge of his datapad, but his focus wasn't on the unread messages piling up. His thoughts were on Serafina and the small stone she had carved the day before. Since their quiet moment together, the alien princess had retreated once more into her formal role. She attended meetings with other diplomats, engaged in polite but distant conversations, and drifted through events as if untouched by any of it. Ethan hadn't expected immediate change. Building trust with someone like Serafina was a slow, careful process. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding back, afraid to let herself step fully into the emotional world she seemed curious about. He needed to do something more, something that didn't feel like a calculated diplomatic move. Something simple. As he mulled over ideas, a burst of laughter echoed from the far end of the hall. Ethan turned, spotting a group of embassy staff gathered by the garden entrance. In the center of the group were the same children Serafina had watched by the fountain. The sight sparked an idea. Later that night, Ethan found Serafina standing on the balcony overlooking the city. The view was stunning. Countless stars glittering above, while Earth's sprawling metropolis twinkled below. Yet, Serafina's gaze seemed fixed somewhere far beyond the horizon. "Princess," Ethan called gently as he approached. She glanced over her shoulder, offering a polite nod. "Ethan, I was wondering if you'd like to join me for something," he said, leaning casually against the balcony railing beside her. "It's nothing formal, just a small gathering." Serafina raised an eyebrow. "A gathering?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Some of the embassy staff are hosting a little festival for their families tonight. There's music, lanterns, nothing extravagant, but it's nice." Her expression didn't change, but he noticed the slight tilt of her head. The same subtle curiosity she tried to conceal. "I appreciate the invitation," she replied, her voice measured, "but I doubt I would fit in." "You'd be surprised," Ethan said with a smirk. "It's not about fitting in. It's just about being there." Serafina's gaze lingered on him for a long moment before she finally nodded. "Very well." The festival was already in full swing by the time they arrived at the embassy's inner courtyard. Strings of paper lanterns crisscrossed above, swaying gently in the breeze. Small booths were scattered around, offering simple games and handmade crafts. The air was filled with laughter and the distant hum of acoustic music. Serafina's steps slowed as they entered, her eyes carefully scanning the crowd. She wasn't tense, but Ethan could tell she felt out of place. "It's not as grand as your world's events, I'm sure," Ethan said, leading her toward one of the booths. Serafina shook her head lightly. "Grand displays are common in Andromeda. But this feels different." They stopped near a small table where the children Ethan had seen earlier were gathered. One of them, a young girl with curly hair, held up a bundle of paper and string. "Want to make a lantern?" she asked Serafina brightly. The alien princess blinked in surprise. Ethan watched with quiet amusement as Serafina glanced at him for guidance, unsure how to respond. He knelt down beside the girl. "I think the princess would love to make one." Serafina hesitated, but when the child held out the materials, she slowly took them. With Ethan's help, she began folding the delicate paper, following the child's instructions carefully. For the next 20 minutes, Serafina sat quietly among the children, her fingers moving gracefully as she shaped the lantern. Ethan noticed how, despite her initial hesitation, she seemed to lose herself in the simplicity of the task. When the lantern was finally complete, the little girl handed Serafina a small candle to place inside. The alien princess lit it carefully, watching as the soft glow filled the paper structure. The girl smiled up at her. "You should let it go with the others." Serafina glanced at Ethan. He nodded encouragingly. Together, they stepped toward the edge of the courtyard, where several lanterns had already been released, floating gently into the night sky. Serafina held her lantern for a moment longer, staring at the warm light flickering inside. Then, with a slow breath, she let it go. The lantern drifted upward, joining the others as they rose higher, tiny beacons against the dark canvas of the stars. Ethan watched her carefully. For the first time since she arrived, Serafina's expression held no trace of formality or restraint. There was something wistful in her eyes, perhaps even peaceful. It's a simple tradition, Ethan said quietly, but I've always liked it. It's a way to send our hopes and memories into the sky, as if the stars are holding onto them for us. Serafina's gaze remained fixed on the lantern as it disappeared into the distance. I think I understand, she said softly. It's not about the lantern itself. It's about the act of letting go. Ethan smiled. Exactly. As they stood side by side, watching the lights fade into the heavens, Ethan felt the weight between them shift. This wasn't diplomacy. It wasn't duty. It was something deeper, something real. And as Serafina stepped closer to him, her voice barely above a whisper, Ethan knew that this night had changed something between them. "Thank you," she said, her fingers brushing lightly against the carved stone tucked in her robe pocket, "for helping me remember what it means to feel." The emotional breakthrough. The festival lanterns had long since disappeared into the night sky, but the soft glow they left behind seemed to linger in the air. Ethan walked quietly beside Serafina as they made their way back toward the embassy's inner halls. The night was still, the kind of quiet that felt rare in a world always buzzing with movement. Ethan stole a glance at Serafina. Her expression had shifted. She no longer carried the same rigid posture that seemed to define her presence in diplomatic meetings. Instead, there was a softness to her, a lingering reflection of the simple joy she had experienced at the festival. But Ethan sensed there was more beneath the surface, something unspoken that hung between them like an invisible thread. As they approached the grand staircase leading to the embassy quarters, Serafina paused at the bottom step. Her gaze drifted upward, but she didn't move to ascend. Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Is something wrong?" Serafina's fingers brushed lightly against the stone she had carved the day before, still tucked safely in the folds of her robe. She didn't answer immediately, but when she did, her voice was quieter than usual. "I spent most of my life fulfilling expectations," she began, her eyes fixed on the distant stars visible through the glass ceiling above them. "My position as princess means I must embody strength, clarity, and reason. Emotions are seen as unnecessary distractions." Ethan leaned casually against the railing, offering her his full attention. "That sounds like a lot to carry." Serafina gave a faint nod. "It is, and for a long time I believed it was the only way to serve my people. But something feels different now." She turned toward him, the faint flicker of uncertainty visible in her violet eyes. "Your world is filled with contradictions. You celebrate strength, yet value vulnerability. You cling to memories of loss, yet find joy in simple things." Ethan smiled softly. "Yeah, we're a complicated bunch." Serafina's gaze lingered on him. "Perhaps that complexity is what makes you resilient. In Andromeda, we are taught that peace is maintained through order and detachment. But I wonder if we have sacrificed too much in pursuit of control." Ethan crossed his arms, sensing that this was more than idle curiosity. "What made you start questioning it?" There was a long pause. Serafina lowered her gaze to the floor, her hands clasping gently in front of her. "My brother," she said quietly. Ethan's posture straightened. This was the first time she had mentioned family. "He was different," she continued. "While I followed the path laid before us, he questioned it. He believed that connection, true, emotional connection, was essential for leadership. He often spoke about breaking the traditions that bound us." Ethan could hear the weight in her voice, the edges of emotion creeping through the carefully maintained exterior. "What happened to him?" he asked gently. Serafina's hands tightened slightly. "He disappeared during an expedition to one of our outer colonies. His vessel was found adrift in the void belt a month later, but he was gone." Ethan exhaled softly. "I'm sorry." Serafina shook her head. "I accepted his loss as part of my duty. I told myself that grieving would not bring him back." Her voice wavered slightly, and she met Ethan's gaze. "But standing by that fountain, watching the children, I remembered how he used to smile, how he would have been the first to join them. Ethan's heart tightened at the vulnerability in her words. "Maybe grief doesn't bring people back," he said carefully, "but it lets us hold on to the parts of them that mattered. The parts that shaped us." Serafina's expression softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to sit on the stone ledge at the base of the stairs, the weight of her memories finally settling around her. Ethan sat beside her, letting the silence stretch between them. "I think," she began after a while, "I feared that if I remembered him too deeply, I would lose focus, that his absence would become too heavy to bear." Ethan looked out at the distant stars. "Maybe remembering him is how you honor him. If he believed in connection, then maybe it's something worth exploring." Serafina reached into her robe and pulled out the carved stone. She traced the pattern with her fingers, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "My brother often spoke of symbols," she said quietly. "He believed that even small things could carry meaning." Ethan glanced at the stone. "Sounds like he would have liked the festival." A soft chuckle escaped Serafina's lips, barely audible but genuine. "Yes, I believe he would have." As the night deepened, the embassy grew quieter, but Ethan and Serafina remained on the staircase, sharing the silence. Eventually, she looked over at him with a rare warmth in her gaze. "Thank you, Ethan, for reminding me that even in distant worlds, some things are universal." He smiled. "Anytime, Princess." At that moment, Ethan realized that whatever diplomatic mission had brought Serafina to Earth had shifted. This was no longer just about treaties or formalities. It was about understanding. And maybe, just maybe, Serafina had found something here that she didn't even know she had been searching for. A new beginning. The days that followed felt different, as if the world around them had shifted imperceptibly, aligning just a little more with the understanding that had begun to blossom between Ethan and Serafina. The formalities still existed, of course, diplomatic meetings, briefings, and reports. But there was an unspoken change, a new layer to their interactions that neither could deny. Ethan noticed it in the small things, the way Serafina began to speak more openly, allowing herself to share thoughts and observations with him that went beyond mere protocol. She still held a certain air of regal restraint, but there was less distance, less coldness. He had started to look forward to their moments together. Whether they were sitting in the garden, talking about Earth's cultures and customs, or simply walking together under the stars, he felt a connection that he hadn't anticipated when he first met her. They were no longer just a diplomat and a princess. They were two people, learning from each other, exploring the edges of a friendship neither could have predicted. On one particularly clear evening, Serafina invited Ethan to join her for a private viewing of Earth's night sky. She had expressed a quiet fascination with the stars since her arrival, and Ethan had offered to guide her through some of the constellations visible from Earth. They stood on the observation deck of the embassy, a vast expanse of glass and steel that gave them an uninterrupted view of the heavens. The air was crisp, and the night was still. A gentle breeze stirred Serafina's silver hair, her silhouette outlined against the glittering stars above. "This is how it looks." Then, Serafina murmured, her voice filled with quiet awe. "So many lights, so many possibilities." Ethan stood beside her, following her gaze. "There's something beautiful about the vastness of it all, isn't there? It reminds you that there's so much more out there than what we see day to day." Serafina nodded, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of distant stars. "Where I come from, we often look inward. We seek perfection in what we already know. But this is different. It makes me wonder what it would be like to look outward, to seek what lies beyond." Ethan smiled, feeling the weight of her words. Maybe that's what your brother saw. He didn't just want to follow the path that had been set for him. He wanted to chart a new course, one where connection and discovery were just as important as duty and strength. Serafina's eyes flickered with something unreadable. She remained silent for a moment, as if considering his words. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer than usual. "He would have liked Earth," she said quietly. "He would have liked the people here." They find strength in things I once thought were weaknesses, emotions, connections, even memories. Ethan's heart tightened at the mention of her brother. He had learned about the loss Serafina had endured, and he understood that it was still a raw wound for her. But there was a new light in her eyes now, something less burdened by the weight of duty and more attuned to the complexities of human connection. I think, Serafina continued, he would have seen Earth as a place of hope, a place where resilience is nurtured, not just in the grand achievements, but in the everyday moments. She paused, turning her gaze toward him. And perhaps it is time for me to learn that. Ethan turned toward her, his voice gentle but firm. You don't have to do it all at once. This journey, the one you're on, it's yours to shape. It's okay to let go of the weight of perfection. Serafina gave him a long, thoughtful look. I thought that perfection was the key to leadership, she said softly. That detachment and control would make me strong enough to guide my people. She smiled faintly, a touch of self-awareness in her expression. But I think I was wrong. Ethan nodded. Strength comes in many forms. Sometimes it's in being vulnerable. Sometimes it's in sharing your story and letting others share theirs. They stood in silence for a moment, both contemplating the vastness of the stars before them. For Serafina, it seemed as though the sky itself had opened up in a way she hadn't allowed herself to experience before. Her journey, though still in its early stages, had begun to shift in a direction that felt more human, more connected. I think I understand now, she said quietly, almost to herself. Perhaps it is not about being perfect or detached. Perhaps it's about sharing the journey with others, about embracing the bonds that come, not just from strength, but from vulnerability and trust. Ethan smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in days. Exactly. For the first time since they had met, Serafina reached out, her hand resting briefly on his arm in a gesture of understanding. It was simple, yet it felt like a profound step forward. I've learned more from you in these few weeks than I could have ever expected, she said, her voice steady but warm. You've shown me that there is power in opening oneself up, in letting go of the idea that we must always be strong. Ethan felt the weight of her words, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to pause around them. He had come to know Serafina as a woman bound by her duty and her past, but now he saw the spark of possibility in her. She wasn't the cold, detached princess who had arrived months ago. She was someone new, someone who was learning to navigate the delicate balance between strength and connection. I'm just glad I could help you see it, he said quietly, his voice soft but sincere. Serafina smiled at him, the warmth in her expression reaching her eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. I think the future holds many possibilities for both of us, perhaps even for my people, if we can learn to see beyond our own boundaries. Ethan stood tall beside her, a sense of quiet satisfaction filling him. And maybe, just maybe, we'll get to explore them together. As the stars twinkled above them, their shared silence felt like a promise, a bond formed not just through duty or diplomacy, but through the understanding that had taken root between them. They had both started from different places, but in the end, they had arrived at the same conclusion. In a world that often seemed vast and disconnected, they had found something worth holding onto. Something deeper, something lasting. And that was only the beginning.